Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a world where soap was optional, sewage was a suggestion, and smelling faintly like a pigsty was not a social crime. Yes, tonight we're stepping into the fragrant, filthy streets of medieval Europe, so you might want to mentally hold your nose. Go ahead, settle into bed, fluff the pillow, and let the day's stress fall away. This isn't going to be a fast-paced adventure. Instead, we're going to float through the everyday realities of hygiene back, when clean was an abstract concept and bathing was something you did once a year, preferably by accident. Picture it. You wake up in your medieval house, if we can call it that. It's a one-room building with a thatched roof that leaks in winter, smoky from last night's fire, and there's a faint aroma of damp straw, wet wool, and whatever the family goat did in the corner. Congratulations, you've survived the night. Step 1. You are now officially awake in the Middle Ages. Naturally, there's no morning shower to look forward to. Instead, you rub your eyes, and if you're lucky, there's a bucket of water nearby that isn't frozen solid. Splash a bit on your face. Not too much, because water has to be hauled from the village well, and that's a job no one fights over. Toothbrush? Not quite. You might chew on a twig or rub your teeth with a rag. If you're wealthy, maybe you own a bit of linen for this purpose, and if you're very lucky, there's mint or sage to rub over your gums. If not, well, your breath smells like what it smells like, and everyone else's does too. Now you have to step outside, which is where things get interesting. There's no running water, no sewer system. The street is not paved. In fact, it is, technically speaking, mud, except that this mud is made of dirt, animal waste, kitchen scraps, and whatever chamber pots were emptied overnight. People literally toss their waste into the street. That's not an exaggeration. They opened a window, shouted a warning, and dumped. And yes, sometimes they forgot to shout. The result is that your medieval shoes, which are basically leather bags, are about to get very unpleasantly acquainted with the morning filth. You might be thinking, well, I just wear boots. No, you wouldn't. Boots were expensive, and you'd be lucky to own one pair of shoes that weren't falling apart. So you step carefully, but it doesn't really matter. Your feet are wet and your socks smell like something you'd rather not identify by mid-morning. Let's drift into the public bathhouse. At least, if you live somewhere that still has one. Bathhouses were more common earlier in the Middle Ages, but the later medieval period started to frown on them. Why? Because anything fun was suspicious, and bathhouses were considered suspiciously fun. People started associating them with immorality, disease, and scandalous behavior. So they closed a lot of them down, leaving ordinary people to wash up at home, which they did very rarely. And even in the golden days of the bathhouse, don't picture some sparkling spa with scented candles. Bathhouses were communal. You'd share a tub with strangers. The water was not changed between visitors unless you were wealthy enough to pay for it, and even then, it wasn't exactly filtered. It was warm, though, which made it the perfect breeding ground for all sorts of medieval skin conditions. Hair care? Well, you might wash it once in a while, but lice were a fact of life. Combs were highly valued, not for styling, but for picking things out of your hair that shouldn't be there. People even passed their combs through the fire to kill the lice, which sounds clever until you realize it means they had enough lice to develop household extermination strategies. Let's drift to the castle, just to see if the wealthy had it better. Short answer, not really. A medieval castle was cold, drafty, smoky, and loud. Yes, you had servants to haul the water for your bath, but you probably weren't bathing daily, weekly, or even monthly. Even royalty might bathe a few times a year, with elaborate ceremony. And yet, they were considered clean compared to everyone else. Toilets? Sure. Castles had guardrobes, which is a nice word for a chute built into the castle wall. You'd sit on a stone bench with a hole to your business, and gravity would handle the rest, ideally landing in the moat below. This was, obviously, not very sanitary, especially when your enemies realized they could climb up those same waste chutes to sneak into your castle. Yes, medieval castles were sometimes infiltrated through the toilets. Speaking of which, let's address the moat. Romantic as it looks, the moat was not just a pretty pond. It was often the catchment area for waste from the castle. So when Hollywood shows heroes dramatically swimming across the moat, just remember, They were basically swimming through a medieval septic tank. Personal grooming was very hit or miss. Perfume existed, but mostly for the wealthy, and mostly to cover up the fact that no one had bathed. People carried pomanders, little balls filled with scented herbs, to sniff when the smell of the street became unbearable. And when I say unbearable, I mean even medieval people who lived with it every day sometimes found it too much. Imagine how bad it had to be for them to notice. Let's not forget dentistry. There was no fluoride, no dentists as we know them, and no reliable anesthesia. If a tooth hurt, you had two options. Live with the pain or let someone pull with pliers, probably a blacksmith, barber, or whoever claimed to know how. Either way, you were going to have a bad day. And yet, despite all this, people somehow made it through their lives. They married, had children, went to church, complained about the weather. Life went on, just with a lot more mud and smell. Maybe that's the part we modern people find hardest to picture, that they got used to it. It was just normal. Would you have survived this daily routine? Or would you have packed up your thatched roof existence and tried to invent indoor plumbing on day one? Let me know in the comments. And as you do, let's drift onward, because medieval hygiene was just a beginning. The real fun starts when we look at what they ate, drank, and thought was medicine. All right, you've made it through the medieval morning without stepping in too much waste. Congratulations. That's an achievement. Now it's time for breakfast, if we can call it that. Don't expect pancakes or coffee. Medieval breakfast, for most people, was whatever was left over from last night, if anything. Maybe a piece of dark, chewy bread that's halfway to being a crouton. Maybe a bit of cheese. If you're lucky, there's ale. Yes, ale for breakfast, because water wasn't always safe to drink, and beer was at least boiled at some point. Let's be honest, the beer was weak, more like slightly alcoholic cereal water, but it did the job. Children drank it, adults drank it, and yes, monks drank it a lot. Monks were famously good brewers. They had strict fasting rules that told them how much solid food they could eat, but liquid bread, which is what beer was considered, didn't count. Naturally, they brewed the strongest beer they could get away with. For the poor, bread was the foundation of the diet, and not the soft, fluffy kind we have today. This was dense, coarse bread made from rye, barley, or whatever grains you could afford. Wheat was a luxury. Your teeth might meet the occasional pebble, because grain wasn't milled with modern precision. Remember those bad medieval teeth from part 1? Yeah, they weren't getting any better. If you had a little more money, you could have pottage, basically a thick stew of grains, peas, and whatever vegetables you had lying around. Sometimes there was a bit of meat floating in there, but meat was expensive, so this was mostly a vegetable affair. And if you're imagining fresh, crunchy vegetables, think again. This is the Middle Ages. Freshness was seasonal. You ate what you could grow or store, which meant a lot of salted, dried, or pickled things that had seen better days. For the wealthy, mealtime was more impressive, at least visually. You have great feasts with roasted meats, pies, and jellies shaped into impressive forms. But even then, medieval food wasn't exactly hygienic. Meat spoiled quickly. Spices were used not just for flavor, but to disguise the taste of meat that was already turning questionable. And since we're here to get sleepy, let's just calmly note that food poisoning was not exactly rare. Speaking of meat, let's talk about what they were eating. Medieval diets were heavily influenced by religion. The church told you when you could eat meat and when you couldn't. There were fast days, and then there were Lent days, and then there were fasting vigils before feast days. The result was that a good chunk of the year, you were technically not supposed to eat meat, which meant a lot of fish. Even if you lived nowhere near the sea, you might be eating salted cod that had been shipped inland. By the time you got it, it was so hard you practically needed a hammer to break it up. Let's drift over to the medieval kitchen. If you picture a warm, cozy hearth, you're partly right. There was a fire, sure, but there was also smoke, soot, and the constant risk of burning your house down. Chimneys were a luxury for much of the Middle Ages, so the smoke just filled the room and escaped through a hole in the roof. Naturally, this meant you spent your cooking hours tearing up from the smoke and smelling like firewood. And then there was medicine, or what passed for it. If you got sick after eating, you might be treated with bloodletting. The logic was that your humors, the four bodily fluids that supposedly govern your health, were out of balance. The solution? Remove some blood, obviously. Barbers doubled as surgeons, so you'd sit in a chair while someone opened a vein. And yes, the classic red and white barber pole really does come from this practice. The red symbolizes blood, the white the bandages. Other cures were equally creative. If you had stomach problems, someone might prescribe ground-up pearls or a mixture of wine and herbs. If you had a fever, you might be wrapped in a blanket and encouraged to sweat out next to the fire. And if all else failed, prayer was always available. Let's not forget that medieval doctors were obsessed with astrology. Your treatment might depend on the position of the moon or the alignment of Mars. Because nothing says sound medical advice like, we can't set your broken arm until Jupiter is in the right house. Of course, if you couldn't afford a doctor, you might go to the local wise woman who would give you a potion made from whatever herb she had. Sometimes these worked, not because of magic, but because some plants actually do have medicinal properties. Other times, it was a placebo. But either way, you'd probably feel better after a nice herbal tea. Or you wouldn't. Either way, there were no antibiotics, so the outcome was a bit of a coin toss. And then there were the truly alarming cures, like using mercury for skin diseases, or powdered mummy. Yes, actual ground-up mummified remains imported from Egypt as a cure-all. This was popular among the wealthy for centuries. You were literally consuming history as medicine. For pain relief, there was wine, opium if you could get it, or just good old-fashioned suffering. Surgery, if it was attempted, was done without anesthesia beyond perhaps a stiff drink. Amputations happened quickly. The idea was to finish before the patient passed out from pain or blood loss. And yet, survival rates were surprisingly high for some procedures, simply because the surgeon was so fast and so practiced. Imagine trying to sleep in a world where your entire health plan was eat bread, hope for the best, and if something hurts, let the barber bleed you. Somehow, people did it, and they even lived long enough to pass on their habits to the next generation. Would you trust a medieval doctor with your stomachache, or would you quietly decide to take your chances with nature? Tell me in the comments. And as we drift onward, we're about to look at something equally fun: medieval clothing, fashion choices, and why no one washed their underwear as much as you like them to. So, you had your breakfast beer, you survived the smoky kitchen, and your humors are allegedly balanced. Time to get dressed. Not that you have many choices. For most medieval people, clothing was not a matter of style. It was a matter of necessity. You had, at best, 1 or 2 sets of clothes. One to wear, one to wash, maybe. Laundry day wasn't every week. It wasn't even every month for some families. Washing clothes took hours of labor. You needed buckets of water hauled from a well or river, lye soap made from ashes, and enough muscle power to scrub everything by hand. So yes, you wore your clothes until they were visibly dirty. And even then, you might just shake them out and keep going. Underwear, if you had it, was usually a simple linen shift, basically a long shirt. This was the one garment most people actually washed when they could, because it sat next to the skin and kept the outer clothes from getting too filthy. That was the theory, anyway. In reality, it meant your underclothes were permanently grimy, and your outer clothes were only slightly less so. For peasants, clothing was rough wool or homespun linen. It was practical. It kept you warm. It did not make you look glamorous. The colors were dull unless you were lucky enough to afford a bit of dye. Even then, dyes were expensive, so bright colors were a sign of wealth. The richer you were, the more ridiculous your wardrobe could get. Let's drift into the upper-class closet. Medieval fashion could be truly wild. Pointy shoes so long they had to be tied to the knee. Sleeves that trailed on the floor. Hats that looked like someone had balanced a cone on their head just to make a point. Fashionable nobles were basically walking power statements. And naturally, the church complained about it constantly. Long shoes were condemned as immoral. Bright colors were seen as sinful, which, of course, only made people want them more. And then there were the sumptuary laws, rules that told you what you could and couldn't wear based on your social class. Imagine the king issuing a decree that says, "No, you are not allowed to wear purple because you are not important enough." Purple was for royalty, silk was for the upper class, fur was for those who could afford it. Everyone else had to stick with whatever didn't get them fined. Shoes were leather, but rarely waterproof, which means every time you stepped into the muddy, waste-filled streets, your feet got soaked. And remember, no socks as we know them, just cloth wrappings or knitted hose. These did not dry quickly. If you've ever put on damp socks in the morning, imagine doing that for most of your life. Now, let's talk laundry again, because this is where things get messy, literally. Washing clothes was a full-day event. You needed to soak them, boil them if possible, scrub them on washboards or against stones, then rinse, wring, and hang them to dry. Soap was harsh, made from animal fat and lye, and not exactly gentle on fabric or skin. If you were a noble, someone else did all this for you. If you were a peasant, congratulations, you did it yourself, and your hand were probably cracked from the lye. And if you didn't have time for proper washing, you just brushed off the dirt and hoped for rain to take care of the rest. Which is why medieval people sometimes simply own enough layers to cover the smell. Yes, layers. Medieval fashion was big on layering. Multiple tunics, cloaks, hoods. The goal was warmth, modesty, and, unintentionally, odor containment. Hair care was its own adventure. For the poor, washing hair was rare. Combing was constant. If you had lice, you'd sit near the fire and try to roast them out. Nobles sometimes had more elaborate hair care routines, with scented oils and combs, but bathing water was still a limited commodity. So perfume became the go-to solution. Cover the smell, don't fix it. Let's drift to the court again, where fashion was a competitive sport. Kings and queens set the trends, and everyone scrambled to keep up. Sumptuary laws or not, if the queen was wearing a hennin, that tall, conical hat, you wanted one too, even if it meant spending half your yearly income. And heaven help you if you were caught wearing something above your station. There are actual court records of people being fined for dressing too well. And then there was fur. Fur was the medieval version of luxury branding. The type of fur you wore told everyone your social rank. Ermine was for royalty. Fox and marten were for the wealthy. Rabbit was for the middle tier. The poorest? Sheep's wool. Maybe cat fur, if you were desperate, though this was frowned upon. Now imagine trying to sleep in wool every night, because you didn't exactly have pajamas. You just slept in your shift, or even in your clothes if it was cold. Sheets, if you had them, were linen and washed rarely, which means the bed didn't exactly smell like lavender. Would you have embraced the linen shift lifestyle, or would you have found a way to invent cotton pajamas just to feel clean once in a while? Tell me in the comments, and let's keep floating, because next we're drifting into something even more charming: medieval work, play, and what counted as entertainment when Netflix was an option. So you're dressed more or less. You've had your breakfast bread and your breakfast beer. It's time to start your day, which, if you're a peasant, means work. A lot of work. There's a reason medieval people didn't need gyms. Their daily lives were already an endurance sport. Most of the population was rural, tied to the land, either as peasants, serfs, or small landholders. The average day was built around farming, plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, depending on the season. Even the children helped, and not in the fun, helping way modern kids might help bake cookies. They helped by carrying water, herding animals, scaring birds out of fields, and doing whatever their parents told them because there was no childcare, just work. Life was cyclical. The calendar was full of feast days, saints' days, and holidays, but most of them still involved labor of some kind. You might get a break from plowing to attend a church feast, but first, you'd spend hours preparing food, dressing up, and walking to the church. The idea of a full day of leisure was a rare luxury. Work was also communal. If you lived in a village, you worked together on the Lord's land as part of your feudal obligations. That meant everyone plowed or harvested at the same time. There was no such thing as working from home, unless your home was a workshop, which for many artisans, it was. If you were a blacksmith, you lived next to your forge. If you were a baker, your house smelled like bread. which at least sounds nice until you realize you were up before dawn every day to get the loaves ready. Miller, cooper, carpenter, your work to find your identity. Let's drift over to the castle again. The nobility didn't exactly avoid work, but their work looked a little different. It meant overseeing estates, collecting taxes, planning hunts, hosting banquets, negotiating marriages. It also meant warfare, because if you were a knight or lord, fighting was part of your job description. And naturally, that meant endless training with swords, lances, and horses, because you never knew when a neighboring lord was going to side your sheep looked very inviting. But medieval people did know how to have fun. Entertainment was a big part of life, mostly because you couldn't work all day, every day, without going insane. In the villages, people told stories, sang songs, and played simple games. Wrestling matches, stool ball, a distant ancestor cricket, and dice games were popular. Gambling was so common that the church kept trying to ban it, which of course made people want to do it more. Festivals were the big events. May Day, harvest festivals, Christmas, midsummer. These were chances to drink, dance, and generally forget how hard life was. Dancing was not formal ballroom style. It was line dances, circle dances, stomping, clapping, and yes, sometimes scandalous levels of revelry. Medieval moralists complained constantly about people getting too wild at festivals. If you lived near a town, you might get to see traveling entertainers, minstrels, jugglers, acrobats. Mystery plays performed biblical stories in the town square, with entire guilds acting out scenes. Imagine your local blacksmith dressed as Pontius Pilate, yelling dramatically while everyone clapped along. It was a good time. Let's not forget tournaments, the medieval version of professional sports. Jousting, melees, and archery contests drew big crowds. The knights got to show off their skill, their armor, and their family crests, while everyone else placed bets and cheered. It was dangerous, of course. People died. But so many things in the Middle Ages were dangerous that this barely stood out. Games were not always polite. Bear baiting, cockfighting, and dog fights were considered good entertainment. Cruel by modern standards, but in a world where slaughtering animals for food was an everyday reality, it didn't seem strange to them. And then there were pilgrimages, travel as spiritual entertainment. You might walk hundreds of miles to visit a shrine. Was it purely religious? Not always. Pilgrimages were also social events. You met people, traded gossip, stayed at inns, sometimes bought tacky souvenirs. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is basically a medieval road trip comedy with a side of spiritual purpose. Evenings were quieter. Without electric lights, people went to bed early or gathered by the fire to tell stories. Storytelling was an art form, and a good storyteller was prize company. You'd hear legends, folk tales, saints' lives, and sometimes just local gossip delivered with flair. And if you think medieval people were too busy or too pious to enjoy jokes, think again. They had plenty of humor, much of it surprisingly bawdy. Medieval manuscripts are full of doodles and jokes scribbled in the margins by bored monks. It seems humanity has always found ways to waste time at work. Would you have enjoyed this rhythm, working with the seasons, breaking up the year with festivals and storytelling? Or would you be sneaking away to invent Netflix just to get out of another Saints' Day play? Tell me in the comments, and as we drift onward, we'll look at something a little more solemn: medieval religion, belief, and why people thought everything from bad weathered stub toes might be a sign from God. All right, you survived another long medieval workday. Now it's time to talk about the one thing that was woven into nearly every part of medieval life: faith. You might think religion today is a big deal, but in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just a part of life, it was life. Everything from when you ate to what you wore to whether you were allowed to dance on a Tuesday was, in some way, tied to the church. Picture your village. Right in the middle is the church, and its bell is basically the medieval version of your phone alarm. It tells you when to wake up, when to work, when to pray, and when to stop what you're doing, because it's a feast day. And there were a lot of feast days. The liturgical calendar was packed. So yes, even the poorest peasant knew which saint's day it was. And yes, they knew which days meant fasting and which meant feasting. The church wasn't just a place of worship. It was the heart of the community. Important announcements were made there. Markets were held nearby. You went there to be baptized, married, and eventually buried. Life was bookended by church bells. And let's not forget the fear factor. Medieval Christianity was heavy on reminders about sin, hell, and the need for confession. The idea was simple. Life is short, eternity is long, and you really don't want to end up on the wrong side of the afterlife. Naturally, this led to a lot of anxiety about whether you had committed sins you've forgotten about. Confession was a regular part of life, and priests heard everything, which meant priests often knew more about their parishioners' personal lives than anyone else. And they were not afraid to use that knowledge to give you a stern lecture. If you had money, you could buy indulgences, basically a little slip of paper saying you'd reduce your time in purgatory. If you had a lot of money, you could endow a chapel or pay for masses to be said for your soul after death, which sounds a bit like a subscription service for salvation. And if you couldn't afford that, well, you could still pray, fast, and do penance. Penance ranged from saying prayers to walking barefoot to a shrine, or in extreme cases, whipping yourself in public. Yes, flagellation was a thing. Groups of flagellants roamed from town to town during plagues, beating themselves to atone for the sins of the world. It was dramatic, a little alarming, and probably not very hygienic. Belief in the supernatural went far beyond church doctrine. People believed in saints who could cure illnesses, holy relics that could protect them, and curses that could ruin them. Relics were big business. A church that owned a famous relic, a piece of the true cross, a saint's finger bone, or a vial of holy blood, could attract pilgrims and donations. Of course, not all relics were authentic. Medieval Europe had enough fragments of the true cross to build a small forest, but authenticity wasn't always the point. What mattered was the faith people placed in it. And then there were the demons, witches, and other supernatural threats lurking in the background. People believed misfortune could be caused by the evil eye, by witches, or by angry spirits, which meant there was a constant effort to ward off bad luck. Charms, amulets, prayers, blessings. Your house might have a protective symbol carved into the beams. Your livestock might be sprinkled with holy water. And naturally, the church took its authority seriously. Heresy was not just a religious crime. It was a social one. A heretic wasn't just wrong. They were dangerous. They threatened the entire community's relationship with God, which is why heresy trials were such a big deal. If you were accused, you could face interrogation, public penance, or worse. Let's drift into a monastery, just to see how the professionals did religion. Monastic life was structured, orderly, and relentless. Monks woke up in the middle of the night for prayers, then again at dawn, then again at regular intervals throughout the day. It was a schedule designed to keep you focused on God and too tired to sin. Monks and nuns copied manuscripts, tended gardens, brewed beer, cared for the sick, and spent hours in silence. If you wanted a break from the chaos of village life, this was one option. Of course, it came with vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, which are a bit of a trade-off. The higher up the church hierarchy you went, the more politics came into play. Bishops were powerful landowners. Cardinals were political players. And popes, well, popes were practically kings in their own right. Some of them were holy and scholarly. Others were, let's say, more interested in fine living. Because naturally, even in a supposedly spiritual office, human nature still found a way to be human. Religion gave medieval life rhythm, meaning, and comfort, but also added a good dose of fear and obligation. Missing Mass wasn't just bad manners, it was a sin. And if something bad happened, famine, plague, war, people wondered if God was angry, if their community had sinned, and what penance they needed to do to make things right. Would you have found this constant religious rhythm comforting? Or would you have quietly muttered about wanting just one day where nobody rang the church bell at dawn? Tell me in the comments. And as we drift forward, it's time to look at something less spiritual but equally intense. Medieval politics, kings, queens, and the spectacularly petty dramas that shaped whole countries. Let's step outside the castle walls now, into the bustling medieval town. Or, to be more accurate, the slightly chaotic cluster of houses, market stalls, and livestock pens that passed for a town. Cities were not quiet places. The moment you walked to the town gates, you'd be greeted with a mix of sounds: hammering from blacksmith, church bells ringing, vendors shouting their prices, dogs barking, pigs rooting around, and the occasional cart rattling over cobblestones. It was a sensory overload. And the smells. Oh, the smells. Medieval sanitation was, let's just say, optimistic. Chamber pots were dumped into the street. Butchers left animal waste wherever they pleased. Tanneries soaked hides in urine, and the smell of that process was legendary. If you lived near a tannery, you probably got very good at breathing through your mouth. The streets were narrow and often muddy. They were not paved, except maybe in the wealthiest parts of town. People threw straw down to soak up the worst of the filth. And yes, pigs roamed freely because they were basically medieval garbage disposals. Markets were the heart of town life. If you wanted food, tools, cloth, or gossip, that's where you went. They were colorful, noisy, and occasionally chaotic. Bargaining was expected. People haggled loudly, arguing over prices until one side gave in. If you were a traveler, you'd look for an inn. Inns varied wildly in quality. Some were comfortable, with food and ale and a place to sleep off the road dust. Others were, well, a room with a bit of straw and a few fleas. Privacy was not guaranteed. Sharing a bed with a stranger was normal. And then there was a town crier, the medieval version of a news feed. He would ring a bell and shout out announcements, because most people couldn't read. If you want to know about a new tax, a lost pig, or a public execution, the crier had you covered. Speaking of executions, public punishment was a form of entertainment. People gathered to watch criminals put in the stocks, whipped, or hanged. It sounds grim, but it was considered a civic event. There wasn't much else to do for fun, and it reinforced the idea that the law was not to be messed with. Towns were also places of opportunity. If you were a runaway serf and managed to live in a town for a year and a day without being caught, you could become legally free, which is why many towns had large populations of people trying very hard not to be recognized by their former lords. Guilds controlled most trades in towns. If you wanted to be a blacksmith, a baker, or a weaver, you joined the guild. They regulated prices, set standards for quality, and made sure outsiders didn't take away business. Becoming a master craftsman could take years of apprenticeship and involved a lot of sweeping floors and running errands before you got to actually practice the trade. Religious life shaped the rhythm of the town. The church bell marked the hours, feast days, and special occasions. Monks and friars preached in the streets, reminding people of their spiritual duties. And of course, there were processions, saints' days, holy relic parades, celebrations for new kings or queens. Towns also had walls and gates, which were locked at night. If you arrived too late, you might find yourself sleeping outside the walls, which was risky, since roads were not exactly safe after dark. Bandits and wolves were not unheard of. And yes, there was fire. Lots of fire. Buildings were made of wood and thatch, and open flames were everywhere. A single kitchen accident could burn down half a town, which is why towns had curfews, not just to keep order, but to make sure everyone put out their fires before sleeping. Disease spread easily in towns because of the close quarters and questionable sanitation. Outbreaks of plague or dysentery could wipe out large portions of the population. Yet people kept coming because the town offered freedom, work, and a sense of possibility that the countryside didn't. Life in town wasn't exactly peaceful. Noise was constant. You could hear your neighbors through the walls. Chickens might wander into your home, but it was lively. There was always something happening. A new shipment of goods, a traveling minstrel performing, or a festival to celebrate the harvest. And when night fell, things got quiet, but not too quiet. The watchmen patrolled the streets, shouting the hours, which might wake you if you were trying to sleep. And if someone had a little too much ale at the tavern, there might be some singing or brawling outside your window. Would you have chosen to live in a medieval town with all the excitement, noise, and smells? Or would you have preferred the slower, quieter life of the countryside, even if it meant more hard labor? Tell me in the comments, and as we drift forward, we'll look at the medieval countryside itself and what daily life was like for the majority of the population, the peasants. Let's leave the noisy towns behind and step into medieval countryside, where the majority of people lived. Here, life moved at a slower pace, but it was by no means easy. The backbone of medieval society was a peasant class, also called villeins or serfs, depending on their legal status. Most peasants did not own the land they worked. Instead, they farmed plots that belonged to the local lord, paying rent through labor, grain, or sometimes both. The system was called manorialism, and it structured nearly every aspect of rural life. A typical day started early. Before sunrise, you were up, maybe with a bit of bread or ale to get you going, and then out into the fields. Work was physical and relentless. You plowed, sowed, weeded, harvested, and cared for livestock. Your year revolved around the agricultural calendar. If you missed a planting or harvest window, there was no food for winter. But it wasn't just your own field you worked. As a serf, you also had to work the Lord's domain, the land reserved for the Lord's own use. That meant a certain number of days each week spent plowing or reaping for him, repairing fences, carting hay, or whatever was required. You might also owe special labor during harvest season or for castle building projects. Life was communal. Villages were tight-knit, with maybe a few dozen families living close together. Houses were simple, wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, dirt floors, smoke from the hearth curling up through the thatch because there was no chimney. Chickens, dogs, or even pigs might wander through the house. Privacy was not really a thing. Meals were plain but filling if the harvest was good. Bread was a staple, sometimes made from mixed grains if wheat was too expensive. Pottage, a kind of thick vegetable stew, was common. Meat was rare for peasants unless it was a feast day or something that had just been hunted or slaughtered. Dairy products, eggs, and ale rounded out the diet. And yes, ale was the everyday drink because water was not always safe. Despite the hard work, villages were social places. People shared tools, gossip, and responsibilities. Weddings, baptisms, and feast days were big events. Festivals might involve dancing, singing, or a little friendly drunkenness. Because if you worked that hard, you celebrated when you could. Religion was central. The parish church was the heart of the community. Everyone knew when Mass was, when saints' days were celebrated, and when it was time to confess your sins. The priest might be the only person in the village who could read or write, and he played a big role in recording births, marriages, and deaths. Children worked young. By 7 or 8, you might be chasing geese out of fields, helping with weeding, or carrying water. Education was rare, unless you were lucky enough to be sent to a monastery school, which most were not. Life taught you what you needed: farming, animal care, basic survival. Peasants were not completely powerless, though they had rights and customs, and lords couldn't just do whatever they wanted, at least not without consequences. Villages had courts to settle disputes over grazing rights, boundary markers, and broken promises. These courts were presided over by the Lord Steward, but the villagers themselves often acted as jurors. And there was more variety than we sometimes imagine. Not every peasant was dirt poor. Some managed to save enough to rent extra land or buy livestock. Others became prosperous enough to hire laborers themselves. And some peasants were actually free tenants, paying rent in money rather than labor, which gave them more independence. Life was fragile. A bad harvest could mean hunger. Famine was a constant threat. Disease could sweep through and take away family members. Winters were long and hard, yet there was resilience, too. Communities supported one another as best they could, and there were moments of rebellion. When taxes were too high or lord became too demanding, peasants sometimes rose up. The most famous example is the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, when thousands of villagers marched on London, demanding lower taxes and better treatment. The revolt was eventually crushed, but it showed that even peasants had limits to their patience. Would you have managed well in a medieval village, rising with the sun, working long hours, and living shoulder to shoulder with neighbors? Or would you have found the lack of privacy and constant obligations overwhelming? Tell me in the comments. Now, as we sail in a bit deeper, let's wander into a more unusual side of rural life. The superstitions, the strange cures, and quiet fears that shaped the medieval imagination. Let's drift now into the quieter, stranger corners of the medieval mind. Because while people worked hard and celebrated when they could, they also lived with a constant sense that the unseen world was never far away. Superstition was everywhere. If your cow got sick, maybe someone had cursed it. If your bread failed to rise, perhaps a neighbor had given you the evil eye. The medieval imagination was full of spirits, saints, angels, and demons, and they were not just abstract ideas. They were part of daily life. Amulets were common. People carried charms made of bones, stones, or bits of scripture to ward off bad luck. Pilgrimages were undertaken not just for piety but to seek healing, because holy relics were thought to cure illness if you could get close enough to them. Medicine was a curious blend of observation and guesswork. Doctors relied on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, the idea was that your humors were out of balance. The cure? Bleeding, purging, or maybe a nice herbal concoction that probably tasted awful. Leeches were popular for bloodletting, because of course they were, and some remedies were just creative. For example, powdered toad was sometimes recommended for certain fevers. And if you had a toothache, one solution was to burn a candle and hold it near the bad tooth, so the toothworm would crawl out. Yes, they believed there were worms living in teeth. Astrology played a big role too. When to plant, when to marry, when to try for a child. All of these could depend on the position of the stars. Even educated physicians consulted the heavens before performing surgeries. And there were witchcraft fears, not as intense as they would become later in early modern Europe. But they were there. Wise women who used herbs might be respected, or accused of working with dark forces if things went wrong. Nighttime could be unsettling. With no electric lights, darkness was complete. Stories of ghosts, wandering spirits, and demons were common. People believed the devil prowled at night, looking for souls to tempt, which is why churches rang bells at certain hours, to keep evil away. This mindset wasn't just fear, though it gave meaning to events. A bad harvest wasn't random misfortune. It was punishment for sin, or a saint's displeasure, or perhaps the result of not giving enough alms. Life was interpreted as a moral and spiritual drama. Would you have found comfort in this worldview, with its saints and charms and constant sense of cosmic purpose? Or would the fear of curses and demons have kept you awake at night? Tell me what you think in the comments. Let's drift onward into courts again, but this time to look at something much louder: medieval warfare, and why it was so much less glamorous than the movies make it seem. When we picture medieval warfare, we tend to think of knights charging with shining armor, banners flying, trumpets blaring. And yes, sometimes it looked like that. But most of the time, war was slow, uncomfortable, and very, very muddy. Battles were actually rare. Most medieval warfare consisted of raiding, burning crops, stealing livestock, scaring the enemy into submission. It was called chevauchée in France, which sounds fancy, but really just meant we burn your field so you'd surrender faster. When battles did happen, they were messy. Armor was heavy, though perhaps not as heavy as movies suggest. Knights could move, but fighting all day in a steel suit under the summer sun was exhausting. Most battles were decided quickly, often in an hour or two, and usually ended with one side running away. Sieges were the real work of war. If you wanted a castle or town, you surrounded it and waited, sometimes for months. You cut off food and water, hoping hunger would do the work for you. And if that didn't work, you tried more creative approaches: building siege towers, using battering rams, or flinging dead animals over the walls to spread disease. Life in a besieged town was miserable. Food ran out, water got contaminated, people grew desperate. And yet, sometimes defenders held out for astonishingly long periods, forcing attackers to give up. What was expensive? 2. Kings had to raise taxes to pay soldiers, which made everyone grumpy, and armies were not always disciplined. Sometimes they looted friendly territory just as eagerly as enemy land. And let's not forget disease. Armies camped together in unsanitary conditions were perfect breeding grounds for dysentery. More soldiers died from illness than from sword wounds. Would you have signed up as a medieval soldier with the promise of loot and maybe a little glory? Or would you have stayed far, far away from the battlefield? Tell me below. As we drift forward, let's leave the mud and noise of war and step back into the glitter of the court, but this time for music, art, and the quieter side of medieval culture. Medieval life wasn't all work and war. There were moments of joy, beauty, and music, even for peasants. Let's settle into the lighter side for a while. Feasts were the highlight of the calendar. Whether it was Christmas, Easter, or a wedding, a feast meant tables groaning with food, roast meats, pies, bread, cheese, ale, and sweets to those who could afford sugar or honey. Entertainment might include jesters, minstrels, or traveling players performing morality plays. Music was everywhere. Lutes, harps, drums, and flutes filled castles and villages alike. People danced. Circle dances, line dances, whatever the occasion called for. Singing together was common, and ballads spread news and stories from one region to another. Festivals were noisy and colorful. May Day celebrations included dancing around the maypole. Carnival season before Lent could involve masks, costumes, and general silliness. The medieval version of blowing off steam before the church reminded everyone to behave again. Even monasteries, despite their reputation for silence, were centers of music and art. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, illuminating them with gold and bright colors. These books were so beautiful, they're still breathtaking today. And there was fashion, bright colors, long sleeves, elaborate headdresses. If you had money, you showed it in your clothing. If you didn't, you did your best to look presentable, because even then, people cared about how they were seen. Would you have enjoyed the dancing and feasting? Or would you have been a quiet one sitting by the fire, just watching? Leave me a note in the comments. Now, let's drift toward the end of our journey, looking at how the medieval world slowly faded and why the Middle Ages eventually gave way to something new. The Middle Ages didn't end all at once. It was more like a slow sunrise, with new ideas creeping in bit by bit. The Black Death changed everything, wiping out so much of the population that labor became scarce. Serfs demanded better treatment or left for towns. The feudal system started to crack. The printing press appeared in the mid-1400s, making books cheaper and spreading ideas faster than ever. Universities grew. People questioned old ways of thinking. Art and science took bold new directions. Gunpowder changed warfare, making castles less useful. Kings began building strong, centralized states, reducing the power of local lords. The Renaissance was on its way. But for centuries, people still clung to many of the old traditions. The church bells, the feast days, the sense that life was a mix of the sacred and the ordinary. So, as we close this journey through medieval life, the smells, the bells, the castles, the plows, the festivals, imagine standing on the edge of that change, watching the world shift slowly towards something new. Would you have been excited for the new ideas, the books, the science, or nostalgic for the old ways, the familiar rhythms of village and church? Tell me below. Thank you for spending this long, quiet journey through the Middle Ages with me tonight. If you're still awake, congratulations. And if you've drifted off somewhere around the plague or the pigs, that's perfectly fine too. If you enjoyed this slow walk through history, I'd love if you liked this video, subscribe for more cozy history nights, and share it with a fellow history lover who might need some sleep. And tell me in the comments, which part of medieval life fascinated you the most? The courts and castles, the village life, the superstitions, or maybe the smell of the towns? I'd love to know.